Money has a way of making people show their true faces, especially when the person asking to move it doesn't fit their narrow idea of wealth. Picture a black woman at the counter, calm voice, simple clothes, quietly explaining numbers, so large they sound like fantasy to the smirking tellers who can't imagine she's serious. The moment those zeros cross their screens, the polite smiles vanish, replaced by suspicion, insults, even security dragging her out for daring to demand what is rightfully hers. But this isn't a story about defeat. It's about the line between arrogance and ruin snapping when you laugh at the wrong person. Hit like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments what you think will happen next, and where you're watching from so you can be part of the conversation. Amara Ellington pressed one palm against the sleek glass door of Franklin Union Bank, feeling its coolness ground her for a second before she forced herself to step inside. The lobby was immaculate, designed to impress. Polished marble floors that gleamed under the afternoon sun filtering through high windows, brass accents that caught the light just so, the quiet hum of air conditioning filling the silence between the muted conversations of customers and the polite, practiced voices of tellers. She wore gray slacks that had lost their crispness, a pale cotton blouse that was just slightly too thin for the cold. No jewelry except for a scratched metal watch whose band pinched her wrist, and a scuffed black tote stuffed with folders and papers. Nothing about her appearance suggested wealth or power. Nothing flashy, nothing imposing. That was exactly how she liked it most days. But today, she felt its weight like an accusation. Because today, she wasn't depositing a paycheck or paying a utility bill. She was here to authorize a $5.8 billion transfer on behalf of her company, a move that had taken years of painstaking negotiations, mergers, acquisitions, and careful strategy to set up. It was the deal that would define the next decade for her firm, ensuring jobs, benefits, contracts. She had everything in order: documentation, approval letters with board signatures, wire transfer forms pre-filled and notarized. She paused just past the threshold, scanning the room. The business services counter was quiet, manned by a single teller who looked up only briefly from her phone before her gaze drifted dismissively over Amara's clothes and returned to her screen. Amara forced herself to step forward. She stopped politely at the marked spot, cleared her throat. The teller still didn't look up. Instead, she brightened immediately when the door behind Amara opened and a tall, broad-shouldered white man in a tailored navy suit walked in. "Good afternoon, sir. How can I help you?" she chirped, voice turning warm and professional in an instant. Amara felt a prickle on the back of her neck. She turned slightly. The man barely glanced at her, smiled at the teller, and nodded as he stepped into line behind Amara, who stood frozen. She cleared her throat again. The teller finally turned her eyes back to Amara, and a smirk tugged at the corners of her mouth. "Oh," she said, drawing it out just enough to make it clear she was mocking her. "I didn't see you standing there." Heat flushed up Amara's neck to her ears. She tried to keep her voice even, polite, professional. "Good afternoon. I'm here to authorize a corporate transfer," she said, pulling out her company ID and the heavy packet of notarized forms. She set them gently on the counter so they wouldn't slide off. The teller's gaze flicked over them, unimpressed. With exaggerated care, she picked up the top page between two fingers, like she was holding something sticky. Her eyes scanned the header: Franklin Union Business Services, wire authorization, $5.8 billion USD. There was a pause. Amara waited. She could hear the blood rushing in her ears. Then the teller burst out laughing. It wasn't subtle. It wasn't polite. It was a sharp, ringing laugh that echoed across the marble lobby, making a couple of heads in line turn. $5.8 billion, she repeated, voice rising in incredulity. Seriously? Amara swallowed hard. "Yes, that's correct. I have all the documentation." She tapped the folder, her finger trembling. "It's an approved and scheduled transaction. Please review it." The teller let out another loud laugh, letting her head fall back a little, eyes rolling. "Ma'am, this isn't a fantasy bank. Let's be real." A couple of people in line snickered. A man in a construction vest nudged his buddy and muttered something that made them both laugh. Amara felt her mouth go dry. She glanced behind her once, saw faces watching, judging. She turned back, forced her voice steady. "This is serious. I'm the CEO of Ellington Holdings. That is our account. Please verify it and process the request." The teller leaned back in her chair, folding her arms like a queen on a throne. "Sweetie," she said slowly, dripping with patronizing venom, "this window is for real corporate customers." The hush that spread wasn't kind. That she had won, again and again. But today, in this marble mausoleum to polite society's money, she felt like a fraud. She wanted to stand, to march back to the counter, to demand respect. But her legs trembled when she tried to move. So she forced herself to sit, to wait. Maybe it would calm down. Maybe they'd see reason. She tried to organize her thoughts, staring into the neatly stacked forms in her tote, willing herself to speak clearly next time. But before she could collect herself, she heard the teller's voice rise over the low murmur of the lobby. "Hey, Marcus. Marcus, come here for a sec." Her tone was loud, pitched to carry. Amara's shoulders tensed. She didn't want to look, but her eyes betrayed her, flicking up in time to see Marcus, the teller from the next window, ambling over with bored curiosity. "What's up?" he asked. Sounding annoyed, he'd been interrupted from his personal conversation with a young woman in line. The first teller held Amara's transfer papers between two fingers, waving them mockingly in the air like a child's art project. "Get a load of this," she said, her lips twisting in a cruel smile. 5.8 billion. Written in crayon, apparently. Marcus leaned over, squinting at the header. He let out a sharp bark of laughter. "Damn," he said, voice thick with mockery. "That's some impressive Monopoly money. Think she wants Park Place with that." A ripple of laughter spread outward from the counter, like a stone dropped in water. Customers in line laughed more openly this time, emboldened by the teller's cruelty. A woman with designer sunglasses perched on her head snickered, whispering to her boyfriend. He chuckled, barely trying to hide it. Amara felt her face go red hot. She squeezed her tote tighter, so tight the canvas bit into her palms. Her mouth opened, but nothing came out. She swallowed, trying to clear the lump in her throat. She could feel her heart beating like a warning drum in her chest. Marcus glanced around at the customers, feeding off the attention. "Gotta love these self-made billionaires," he said to no one in particular. "Guess anyone with a ballpoint pen can be a CEO these days." The first teller pretended to look hurt. "You think she'll transfer some of that to us if we're really polite?" Marcus snorted. "I'll hold my breath." Amara finally found her voice, though it was hoarse and low. "Stop," she said. It barely carried. No one seemed to hear. She forced it louder, her voice cracking. "Stop it." The first teller arched an eyebrow, still smirking. "Sorry, ma'am," she said, drawing out "ma'am," until it dripped with disdain. "Did you say something?" Amara licked her lips. Her mouth was so dry. "I said, stop. Just do your job. Please." The teller leaned forward, eyes narrowing with delight. "Oh, we're what's the phrase? Reviewing your paperwork." She turned it over in her hands, flipping it carelessly, smearing a faint fingerprint across the company letterhead. Amara's eyes followed every movement, her fingers twitching. She knew she should get up, take it back, demand it be treated properly. But she stayed in the chair. Her knees felt like jelly. She watched as the teller dropped the entire packet onto the counter with a dismissive flick, the pages slipping askew. "Oops," she said. "Hope that wasn't important." Marcus let out another chuckle and leaned in. "Want me to help you pick it up?" His tone was mocking, heavy with false chivalry. Amara forced herself to stand. The chair scraped against the floor with a squeal that turned a few heads. She forced her feet to move, walking stiffly back to the counter. She didn't care that people watched. She didn't care that her vision blurred at the edges. She just needed those papers. She reached out and began gathering them up, fingers fumbling, the pages crinkling under her hurried grip. The teller didn't help. She watched, leaning lazily on her elbows, face resting in her palms like a bored child watching a street performer. Marcus leaned over further. "Careful," he said in a sing-song voice. "Don't want to lose track of those billions." Amara's hands shook. She tried to smooth the pages on the counter, but they wouldn't lie flat. The top page now had a greasy smudge where the teller's fingers had pressed too hard. Her company seal was partially obscured. She took a deep, shuddering breath, willing herself not to cry, not to shout, not to let them see her fall apart. Amara felt her throat burn. She swallowed hard, blinked twice, forcing back the tears that threatened to betray her in front of these strangers who watched her as if she were an exhibit behind glass. She shifted slightly, trying to smooth the papers on her lap, crumpled edges scraping her palm, smudged ink a testament to the fingerprints, and scorn pressed onto them. She told herself she just needed one chance, just one moment to reset, to explain, to prove she wasn't what they were whispering. She had to believe that reason would win if she could just get them to listen. But the teller wasn't done. She straightened in her chair, cleared her throat dramatically, and glanced around the lobby with exaggerated patience. Then she raised her voice louder than necessary, her tone thick with feigned apology that fooled no one. "Folks," she called out, voice carrying with ease across the marble floors, bouncing off the polished walls. "I'm sorry for the delay, but we're verifying a suspicious claim here." Her eyes flicked deliberately to Amara, full of icy triumph. Amara felt every head turn. She felt the heat rise up her neck to her cheeks. She wanted to vanish into the floor, to dissolve into the stone beneath her feet. The murmurs began almost immediately. A woman with a designer handbag tugged at her husband's sleeve, whispering behind the shield of her glossy hair. "Is she trying to scam them?" she hissed, just loud enough to carry. A teenager snickered from behind his phone, no doubt recording the scene for social media. Someone else muttered "con artist" under his breath, and the words seemed to echo through the space, repeating in her ears like a curse. Amara opened her mouth, but no sound came. She forced herself to her feet anyway, ignoring the way her knees threatened to buckle. She took a shaky step toward the counter, tote clutched in front of her like a shield. "Please," she said, voice breaking. "This is a legitimate transaction. I have all the documentation. It's scheduled. Please, just look at it properly." The teller didn't even bother to hide her smirk. "Ma'am," she said, putting an exaggerated emphasis on the word, dripping with mock sympathy, "we can't process fraudulent paperwork here. I've already explained that." Amara's fingers tightened so hard around the tote strap that the canvas bit into her palm. Her breath came faster, a panicked, ragged rhythm she couldn't control. She tried to speak again, to beg, but the words tangled in her throat. Marcus folded his arms, leaning back in his chair like he was watching a show. "Honestly," he drawled, voice heavy with amusement, "we get all kinds in here, but this is new. 5.8 billion. That's cute." A couple of customers laughed. The sound was sharp, ugly, and it sliced through her composure like a blade. The teller sniffed, pushing a button on her desk with practiced finality. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave," she said. "We don't tolerate this kind of behavior." Amara blinked, confused, dazed. "What behavior?" she managed to whisper. The teller's lips twitched. "Fraud," she said simply, and the word landed like a hammer blow. Amara felt the blood drain from her face. She shook her head slightly, mute horror flooding her chest. She opened her mouth, but before she could respond, a new voice cut through the lobby. "Ma'am," it barked, deep, authoritative, cold. She turned, heart hammering, to see two uniformed security guards striding through the double doors at the back of the branch, their eyes hard and impersonal. One of them adjusted his belt, the metal glint of his badge catching the light. The other spoke into his radio before turning his attention squarely onto her. "We have a situation," he asked, but it wasn't really a question. The teller pointed at Amara with a stiff, theatrical motion. "Yes," she said, voice sharp and certain. "We need to remove this woman. She's attempting fraudulent activity." The words were poison. They settled over the lobby, and the murmuring began anew. Amara felt her mouth go dry. She tried to form words, to explain, to plead. "It's not fraud," she whispered. The taller of the two guards stepped forward, expression hard as granite. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to come with us." His hand rested meaningfully near the radio on his belt, as if anticipating trouble. Amara shook her head desperately. Please, look at the paperwork. Just look at it. It's legitimate." Her voice cracked. It sounded pitiful even to her own ears. The guard didn't move. "Ma'am," he repeated, voice flat, "you need to come with us now." The teller behind the counter folded her arms, looking pleased, satisfied. Marcus leaned back in his chair, watching with open amusement. The customers parted in the lobby like the sea, giving the guards room to move in on her. Someone held up a phone, recording the scene with gleeful curiosity. Amara felt her knees buckle slightly as the guard stepped closer. She raised one trembling hand. "Don't, please. Don't touch me. I'll go." Her voice was high, panicked. Her throat burned. The guards flanked her anyway, one on each side, close enough that she could smell the faint hint of deodorant and starch from their uniforms. Inside the glass doors, she could see the teller smirking and saying something to Marcus, both of them laughing, and the customers inside watching her like she was a show put on for their amusement, their noses pressed to the drama of it all, while the security guards conferred near the entrance, one of them glancing at her through the glass with casual disinterest, like she was just another problem swept out with the morning trash. Her fingers tightened around the tote, so hard she thought the cheap fabric might rip, her breath coming in shallow gasps that made her vision waver at the edges. She turned away from the doors, desperate to find some corner of shade, some quiet where she could gather the shreds of her dignity. But the bank was set in a sea of concrete and glass, no shelter from the heat or the stares of passers-by who slowed to watch this well-dressed black woman with the haunted eyes and the shaking hands. She wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand, smearing sweat and tears across her cheek in one ugly streak, and forced herself to turn back toward the door. She couldn't leave. She couldn't let this happen. This transfer wasn't a favor or a whim. It was payroll for hundreds of employees, a merger that would secure contracts and healthcare and futures. She had spent years clawing her way to legitimacy in an industry where men like Marcus laughed in meetings and took credit for her numbers. She had won, and she would not let them erase that with a smug smirk and a dismissive wave of the hand. She took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, forced her legs to move despite the leaden weight of her shame and fear, and she pushed the door open again. The cold blast of air conditioning hit her immediately, prickling her overheated skin with goosebumps. The lobby went quiet for a half second as she stepped back inside, her flats scuffing the polished marble. Conversations faltered. The teller's head snapped up. Marcus actually smiled in disbelief. The security guards straightened from their slouch, eyes narrowing in annoyance. She stood there, swaying slightly, chest heaving, every nerve screaming at her to turn and run, to hide, to sob behind the wheel of her car. But she made herself speak. "I want to speak to your manager," she said, her voice rough and cracking, but clear enough to carry in the stunned silence. The teller raised her eyebrows, blinking in mock surprise, then leaned back in her chair. "Oh, you want to speak to the manager now," she repeated, voice dripping with sarcasm. Marcus let out a small laugh, shaking his head. "Guess she wants to go for round two." Amara ignored them both, fingers tightening on her tote. The corner of a crumpled authorization form digging into her palm until she felt the sharp sting of broken skin. One of the security guards stepped forward, planting himself between her and the counter. "Ma'am," he said, voice firm, "you've been asked to leave. Don't make this harder." She lifted her chin, eyes shining with defiance and despair. "Call your manager." The guard's eyes flickered to the teller, who shrugged as if bored already. With a theatrical sigh, she pressed a button on the phone at her station. "David," she said sweetly, "we have a situation out front. She wants to speak to you." She didn't bother to hide the mocking smile. Within moments, a door at the side of the lobby opened with a muted click, and out stepped a man in a tailored navy suit that strained slightly at the buttons, his neatly parted hair slicked back, and an expensive watch gleaming on his wrist. Her legs wanted to collapse under her, to crumple onto the sidewalk in defeated sobs, but she refused to give them that spectacle. Instead, she forced herself to pace back and forth in front of the bank's glass facade, drawing ragged, dry gulps of air, her eyes darting back and forth as if searching for some unseen hope that might appear out of the traffic and heat haze. Inside, she could still see the cool marble lobby, the air conditioning fogging the glass slightly around the heavy door frames. The image of the manager turning away without even glancing at her ID burned itself into her mind, each blink replaying it in looping, excruciating detail, and she could hear the teller's laughter in her memory, the jeering tone of "sweetie," like acid in her ears. She wiped the sweat and tears from her face with the back of her shaking hand, smearing the foundation that had started the day as a confident mask of competence and was now a mess of streaks and patches. She looked at her reflection in the glass door, saw the loose hairs stuck to her forehead, the redness of her eyes, the trembling of her jaw, and for a terrifying moment she did not recognize the woman staring back. This was not the CEO who had negotiated million-dollar deals, who had fought competitors in boardrooms and smiled for press photos announcing landmark partnerships. This was a woman gutted of all pretense, exposed and humiliated like a thief dragged into the town square. Her chest heaved once, twice, but she forced the sobs back down, swallowing hard enough to make her throat hurt. She didn't have time for crying. She didn't have time for collapse. The funds had to move today. Payroll depended on it. Contracts depended on it. Her reputation depended on it. She would not let them destroy everything she had built. She turned on her heel and forced herself back up the stairs, shoving the door open so hard it rattled in its frame. The lobby quieted the moment she stepped in. Conversations faltered. Heads turned. She felt the weight of dozens of eyes settle on her, cold and curious, the atmosphere tightening like a noose around her throat. The security guard who had escorted her out was still by the door, his arms crossed over his chest, a look of weary irritation settling onto his face as he exhaled through his nose. "Ma'am," he said flatly, "I'm going to ask you not to make this worse for yourself." She ignored him, focused on the teller counter, on the little fortress of polished wood and marble where the teller and Marcus stood, still laughing at some private joke, their smiles freezing when they saw her approach again. She didn't speak at first. She just stood there, chest heaving, tote hanging limply at her side, the papers inside crumpled and damp from her own sweat. Her hair clung to her cheeks in damp tendrils. The teller's eyebrows lifted. "You're persistent, I'll give you that," she drawled, her voice loud enough to carry through the lobby with ease. A couple of people in line snickered. Marcus leaned sideways on the counter, grin wide and eyes glittering. "Back for more?" he asked. "Seriously, you should try the lottery next. Better odds." Amara tried to steady her voice, tried to find that calm, measured tone she used in negotiation rooms, but it cracked on the first syllable. "I'm not leaving until you process this transaction." The teller's mouth twisted into a mocking pout. "Aw," she said, voice dripping with exaggerated sympathy. "Look at her. She's really trying." She turned her head slightly to Marcus, still keeping her voice loud enough to project. "Should we tell her, or do you want the honors?" Marcus snorted. "I'll take it," he said. He straightened and fixed Amara with a look that was equal parts amusement and disgust. "Ma'am, this is a bank," he said in a slow, careful tone like he was speaking to a child. "Not a charity, not a comedy club. If you want to play billionaire, try Monopoly." She blinked rapidly, tears mixing with sweat and stinging her eyes until she could barely see the bright, indifferent shapes of the cars passing by on the street, horns blaring distantly in the heat-shimmered air. She wiped at her face with a shaking hand, leaving dirty streaks across her cheeks, gasping for breath like she'd run a marathon. She wanted to run. She wanted to scream. She wanted to collapse onto the concrete and curl into herself and never move again. But she made herself stand, trembling, her tote biting into her arms. She turned in a slow, unsteady circle, disoriented, lost, but there was nowhere to go. The bank loomed behind her, pristine and unyielding, its polished windows reflecting back an image of a woman broken and small and defeated, while the sun overhead baked the sidewalk until it burned through the soles of her cheap flats. She could still see faces through the glass doors, customers craning their necks, watching her like an exhibit, like a warning of what happened to people who didn't know their place. And then she saw the teller at the counter, framed perfectly in the doorway's glass pane, leaning forward on her elbows with that same cruel smirk, saying something to Marcus that made them both laugh again. The heat pressed in all around her, suffocating, filling her ears with the roar of her own blood. She thought she might faint, but she didn't. She forced herself to stand there, to keep breathing, to keep existing in this space where every fiber of her being was screaming for her to flee. And that's when the door swung open again, with a quiet hiss of the air seal releasing, and one of the security guards stepped outside, a thick-set man with sweat stains under his arms that did nothing to soften the hard, impassive lines of his face. He held something in his meaty hand, folded paper, the Franklin Union logo stamped in blue on the top. She flinched when he approached, her body going rigid with dread. He didn't speak at first. He just thrust the paper toward her, holding it like a dirty rag he didn't want to touch. She stared at it for a moment, uncomprehending, until he shook it once, impatient, making the cheap copier paper crinkle in the heat. "Take it," he said flatly. Her hand trembled as she reached out, fingers brushing his for an instant before she snatched it back to her chest, crumpling it even further as she clutched it along with the tote. She looked down, blinking away tears, forcing her eyes to focus on the blurry text. Trespass warning. Her name typed in all caps, spelled correctly. The date. The branched address. The words slammed into her like a punch to the ribs. She couldn't breathe. She tried to form words, tried to make sense of the swirling letters, but they didn't make sense. She lifted her head slowly, mouth working silently, and finally croaked, "What is this?" The guard didn't even blink. "Notice of trespass," he said, voice as flat as a tombstone. "You're banned from this property. Attempted fraud. Manager's orders." The words felt like hot tar poured over her head. Attempted fraud. Attempted fraud. Attempted fraud. The phrase beat against her skull in time with her racing heart. She opened her mouth to scream, to deny it, to beg, but nothing came out but a strangled, wet noise. The guard watched her with the unblinking patience of a stone gargoyle, unmoved by the way her shoulders shook. When she didn't speak, he jerked his chin at the door behind him. "Don't come back," he said, voice so casual it was like he was telling her the weather forecast. "Next time we call the cops." She didn't know how long she stood there on the sidewalk in front of the bank's grand sunlit facade, blinking away tears that refused to stop falling. Her chest hitching with sobs she tried to swallow back down. She wiped at her face with the back of her hand, smearing tears and sweat and smudged makeup in an ugly streak that felt like war paint for a battle she was losing. Her breathing was ragged, shuddering in shallow gasps that made her vision tilt at the edges. She tried to remember how to stand up straight. She tried to remember how to be the woman who had closed million-dollar deals in rooms full of sneering men who didn't want her there. She tried to remember the way she had smiled at reporters when they asked how it felt to be a black woman CEO in an industry where she was the only one in the room. She couldn't. She felt hollowed out. She felt small. She felt dirty. The security guard who had shoved the trespass notice at her watched from inside the door, arms crossed over his barrel chest, eyes narrow with contempt that didn't even bother to hide itself. When he finally turned away, she realized she was still standing there like a lost child waiting for a parent to come fetch her. She blinked, coughed to clear her throat, and forced herself to move. Her feet felt like they were made of lead. She shuffled forward, each step scraping painfully on the rough concrete, her eyes fixed on the ground in front of her. She didn't dare look up. She didn't want to see the people slowing on the sidewalk to stare at her, their curious glances like sharp pebbles thrown at her back, the way they quickly looked away when she turned her head even slightly in their direction. She managed to make it to the edge of the building, where the heat from the sun-soaked brick burned against her arm as she leaned on it for support, the rough surface scraping her skin through the thin fabric of her blouse. She took a few deep, ragged breaths, wiped her face again with her sleeve until it was wet and filthy, and tried to think. She had no plan, no next step. She felt the world tilting underneath her like a listing ship, and she closed her eyes against the swirl of dizziness that threatened to drop her to the concrete in an undignified heap. Then she heard the door open behind her again with a quiet, hydraulic hiss of air being sucked in around the seals, the sound that had become a nightmare in her ears. She didn't turn around right away. She didn't want to see, but she heard the voices, clear as day, slicing through the hot, stagnant air like knives. Make sure she knows she's banned from the premises. forever. It was the bank manager's voice, cold and smooth, the same board authority that had told the guards to remove her without looking at her paperwork, without asking a single question. She felt her spine stiffen involuntarily, shame and fury warping inside her chest into something hot and brittle that made her hands shake even harder. She turned slowly, unable to stop herself, just in time to see the security guard nodding solemnly at the manager before glancing at her with obvious disdain. "You heard the man," the guard said loudly, projecting his voice so it would carry to the people gathered nearby, who had slowed to watch this drama unfold in the hot afternoon sun. "You're banned from this branch. Permanently. Don't come back here. Ever. You understand me?" She felt her mouth open, try to find words, anything that would claw back a shred of her dignity. But her voice cracked in her throat and nothing came out but a dry rasp. She swallowed hard, tried again, but it was no good. The words wouldn't come. She felt tears well again, hot and blinding, but she refused to let them fall. She blinked furiously, pressing her tongue to the roof of her mouth in a futile effort to stop the shaking in her jaw. The guard didn't wait for an answer. The Franklin Union logo, distorted where the paper was wrinkled and torn, the words "attempted fraud," still visible even though her tears had smudged the ink into dark, ugly streaks. She blinked rapidly, trying to clear her vision, fighting the sting in her eyes as hot tears welled up again, threatening to spill down her cheeks and broadcast her weakness to the strangers on the sidewalk who spared her curious, uncomfortable glances before quickly looking away. She felt like she had no skin left, like every word they'd thrown at her in that lobby had stripped her raw, exposing nothing but nerve endings and shame. She turned down a side street, away from the main entrance, needing the cover of shade, the illusion of privacy, even though there was none to be had in this city. She found a narrow alley next to the bank service entrance, half blocked by an overflowing trash bin that stank in the heat, but it was empty, and she pressed herself against the cool, graffiti-smeared wall, sliding down until she was sitting on the cracked pavement with her knees pulled up to her chest, the tote bag clutched in her lap like a child's security blanket. She couldn't breathe. Every time she tried to suck in a deep lungful of air, it caught in her chest, coming out in a shuddery sob that scraped her throat raw. She tried to speak to herself the way she always did when the pressure got too much, tried to say the words that had carried her through so many boardrooms, so many hostile investor meetings. "You are in control. You are the boss. You are the authority in the room." But they felt like lies now. They sounded ridiculous even inside her own head. Because she hadn't been the authority in that room. She hadn't been anything. Just a pathetic, sobbing mess with no power, no voice, no dignity left. And they had loved it. She wiped her face with the heel of her hand, smearing sweat and tears and grime across her cheek, blinking at the alley around her that felt like it was slowly closing in, the smell of rot and hot trash making her gag. She forced herself to breathe, to calm the trembling in her hands. She reached into the tote bag with numb fingers and pulled out her phone. The screen cracked at one corner from where it had hit the ground in the chaos earlier. She stared at her reflection in the black glass for a long moment, saw the wild, bloodshot eyes, the tear-streaked face, the limp, sweaty hair stuck to her forehead, and felt another wave of nausea rise. She forced herself to unlock the screen. Her fingers hesitated, trembling. Then she found the number she needed. Her thumb hovered over the call button. She thought about what it would mean, what would happen next, the damage it would do. But then she thought about the manager's face as he ordered her removed without even looking at her paperwork. The teller's triumphant smile behind the glass. The guard's flat, contemptuous voice telling her she was banned for life. She pressed the call button. It rang twice before picking up. A calm voice answered on the other end. Ellington Holdings Treasury Office. She swallowed, cleared her throat, her voice cracking horribly on the first word before she forced it steady. "It's Amara," she said, low and cold, her eyes burning holes in the cracked concrete at her feet. "Authorize immediate recall on all pending transactions through Franklin Union. I want every dollar out of their custody before close of business." She could hear the faint clicking of a keyboard on the other end. "Ma'am," the voice said carefully, "that's $5.8 billion in assets. Are you sure?" She closed her eyes. She could see the teller's smirk, the manager turning his back, the laughter, the word fraud stamped on the paper in her shaking hand. She opened her eyes. They were cold now, empty. "Execute the transfer recall," she said, voice like broken glass. "Freeze their liquidity lines." Today, there was a pause, then a respectful, almost fearful, "Yes, ma'am." "Understood." The line went dead. She lowered the phone, her arm feeling like it weighed 100 pounds, and let it fall into the tote with a quiet thunk. She stared at the wall for a long moment, feeling the sun shift on her face, the heat pressing into her bones. She didn't smile. She didn't feel triumphant. She felt nothing at all. Inside the bank, the systems were already lighting up with red alerts. In a back office, the branch manager frowned at his screen as an error code blinked next to every pending transaction for Ellington Holdings. He scrolled frantically, sweat beading on his upper lip, watching as line after line changed status from processing to recalled. He clicked furiously, but the confirmation was there in cold, unyielding font. $5.8 billion USD, recalled. In another corner of the bank, the teller who had humiliated Amara was still gossiping with Marcus when her screen blinked with a new message. Urgent. Liquidity freeze alert. The phone sat dead in her tote bag, the screen black and cracked, the battery long since drained. But she didn't need to check it to know what was happening. She knew the protocol. She had designed it herself. The moment the recall command hit the bank's core systems, the process would move with mechanical certainty. The $5.8 billion in pending wire transfers, reserves, and overnight lending collateral would vanish from the bank's custody. The bank's internal ledger flashing error messages as balances dropped below minimum thresholds, as overnight interbank funding lines dried up, as counterparties refused to clear new transactions without proof of liquidity they no longer possessed. She could almost see it happening in her mind's eye as she sat in the filthy alley, the muffled sounds of car horns and street noise blurring around her in the baking heat. She imagined the manager who had dismissed her without a glance pulling at his collar as he sat behind his polished mahogany desk, the screen in front of him filled with red text, the blinking warning icons multiplying faster than he could dismiss them, his email and phone buzzing in frantic, discordant harmony as compliance officers, senior VPs, and the bank's own lawyers demanded explanations he did not have. She imagined the teller, her eyes wide and white around the irises for once, her smug voice faltering as Marcus asked her what she had done, the smile melting from her face like wax in a furnace as the branch's back office staff whispered, pointing fingers, eyes accusing even before they had all the facts. She sat there long enough for the sun to slip lower, for the shadows to deepen and cool, for the rumble of the city to soften around her. When she finally stood, her knees creaked and her back protested, and she gathered her tote bag in numb fingers, brushing the grime from her slacks without much success, blinking at the alley mouth where the street now glowed with the neon haze of approaching dusk. She did not go home. She did not go back to her office. She walked, one slow block at a time, past the bank's grand front doors with their spotless brass handles and polished marble steps, past the windows where the blinds were drawn now, blocking any view of the lobby that had humiliated her so thoroughly just hours ago. She paused once across the street to watch the lights flicker inside, the silhouettes of people gesturing wildly, pointing at screens, huddling in close, panic conferences. She watched as a man in an expensive suit, her manager, she realized with dull satisfaction, stormed out of the doors with 2 security guards flanking him, his face red and shining with sweat even in the cooling evening, his tie askew, his hair mussed as he held a small box of belongings against his chest like a shield. A reporter snapped pictures from the curb, shouting questions about fraud, about discrimination, about mass client withdrawals. He did not answer. He did not even look up. He just shouldered past the cameras and kept walking, his shoes slapping hard against the concrete in unsteady, angry rhythm. Moments later the teller emerged, hair no longer perfectly slicked into place, face pale and drawn, her red lipstick smudged as if she tried to wipe it off in a hurry and failed. She carried nothing. Her hands were empty and shaking at her sides. She glanced once at the reporters, eyes wide and wet in the camera flashes, before she lowered her gaze to the sidewalk and shuffled off down the block, trying to outrun the questions she would not answer. Amara watched them both go without moving, her face blank, her fingers tight on the tote strap, the crumpled trespass notice still inside like a relic of another life. She listened as the reporters turned to each other, muttering about internal sources confirming terminations, about statements being prepared for the press, about the bank's PR office refusing to take calls. She listened as the questions changed from who to why, from the fired employees to the policy that had driven them to treat her the way they had. She watched the First News van pull up at the curb, the logo bright and crisp even in the gathering dark. She listened to the anchors speak in calm, urgent tones about systemic discrimination, about corporate accountability, about massive client withdrawals threatening Franklin Union stability. She turned and walked on. Further down the block, electronic billboards above the street began flashing red headlines from financial networks. Franklin Union stock plummets 23% IN after hours trading. Clients pull billions in protest. She heard snatches of conversation from people watching the screens, commuters with briefcases and tired eyes murmuring about boycotts, about moving their accounts, about how it was about time banks faced consequences. She walked past a convenience store where the TV behind the counter showed an overhead helicopter shot of the bank's downtown headquarters. Dozens of suited executives milling in the glass lobby like ants, the voiceover calmly narrating how analysts warned of possible insolvency if client outflows continued at this rate. Amara stood in line at the little corner cafe she liked now that she had moved the company headquarters out of the downtown financial district. The new offices smaller, but filled with staff who respected her, who had chosen to stay even when the bank fiasco made headlines and the competitors circled like vultures. She wore her usual simple gray slacks and a soft cream blouse, no jewelry, but the same battered watch that had ticked through her worst day. Her hair was tied back in a no-nonsense bun, practical and unfussy, and her eyes were clear though still shadowed with the memory of what had happened months before. She ordered her black coffee and stepped aside to wait, inhaling the smell of roasted beans, cinnamon, and warm baked goods. She liked this place because it was quiet, friendly, without being fake, a space that reminded her why she had built her business in the first place, to make something that lasted, something good. She watched the barista call her name, offered a small thank you, and turned to find a seat when she froze for a fraction of a second. At the far end of the counter stood the teller, or rather, the man who had been the teller. He was leaner now, hair grown out in an unruly wave that he hadn't bothered to style, uniform replaced with a cheap black polo with a faded check cashing service logo over his heart. He looked tired in a way that went beyond sleep, older even though he was probably only in his late 20s. His face was drawn, eyes flicking down to the floor any time a customer spoke. His voice careful and hushed, none of the arrogant, slicing sarcasm he had once used to eviscerate her in front of a full lobby. He did not see her at first. He was too busy watching the barista hand back change to another customer, carefully avoiding eye contact with anyone, posture slumped like he was trying to be invisible. She considered turning away, pretending not to see him. It would have been easy, but she didn't. She took a slow step forward, then another, until she was standing right beside him. She saw the moment he noticed her, the jerk of his shoulders, the widening of his eyes, the sudden flush of red up his neck to his ears. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out, throat working. He looked like he might bolt. She didn't speak. She simply watched him, letting the silence grow heavy, letting the memories settle between them like thick, choking smoke. He swallowed, tried again, voice cracking. I didn't know you came here." She raised an eyebrow. "I live around the corner." He winced, eyes darting down to the floor. "Right. Of course." "I didn't," he broke off, pressing his lips into a thin, bloodless line. He tried to pull himself together, to recover even a shred of dignity. "Can I help you with something?" She tilted her head slightly, considering him, the tremble in his fingers as he wiped them on his apron, the exhaustion that clung to him like a second skin. She thought about the bank's marble lobby, the polished brass, the way he had laughed with Marcus, how he had called her sweetie and told her to take her game somewhere else. She thought about the way he had refused to look at her paperwork, the way he had enjoyed her humiliation like it was entertainment. And she remembered the news coverage that followed, the layoffs, the bank's near collapse, the photo of him leaving the branch with a banker's box under one arm and his head down to avoid the cameras. She saw all of it at once and then let it go. She reached into her tote, pulled out a $20 bill, and slid it across the counter toward the barista. "His coffee's on me," she said quietly, her voice level and clear. The barista blinked but nodded, punching in the transaction without comment. The teller's mouth fell open. He stared at the money, then at her. His voice shook. "Why would you do that?" She didn't answer him immediately. She pulled a napkin from the holder on the counter, took the dull, borrowed pen the cafe kept by the register, and wrote in careful, deliberate script, "Grow. Do better." She folded the napkin once and set it in front of him, tapping it lightly with her fingertip. Then she picked up her own cup and turned without waiting for his response, walking to the door with her back straight, her shoulders steady. She did not look back to see his expression. She didn't need to. The bell over the door chimed as she stepped out into the street, the wind catching at her hair, the sun warm on her face. And for the first time in months, she felt her lungs expand properly with a deep, cleansing breath. Time passed. Seasons shifted. And one evening, months later, Amara sat in the back row of a cramped community center basement with paint peeling from the cinder block walls and a battered whiteboard covered in faded markers. She was there because her company had funded the program, a free financial literacy course for anyone who wanted to learn how to budget, save, or plan for a small business. She insisted on attending sometimes, not to lecture, but to watch, to make sure the promise was real, that it wasn't another corporate PR stunt that took people's trust for granted. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, listening as the man at the front of the room spoke in a low, earnest voice, marker in hand, as he wrote out the difference between APR and APY for a group of teenagers and young adults who watched him with a mixture of boredom and curiosity. He was different now. He still had the unruly hair, the tired eyes, but there was a careful kindness in his voice, a humility in the way he checked for understanding after every question, making sure no one was lost. And near the end of the session, when one of the teens scoffed about who even cares about this stuff, it's all a scam anyway, he paused, set the marker down, and let silence fill the room before he spoke. "You should care," he said quietly, voice tight with something deeper than anger. "Because the worst mistake you can make is judging someone by how they look or what you think you know about them. I did that once. It cost me everything." The room went quiet. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. Amara watched from the back, her lips pressing together, eyes stinging for reasons she couldn't explain even to herself. She stood at the end of the session and quietly left without talking to him, letting the door close softly behind her as the kids clustered around him with their questions. As he leaned down to help them with their worksheets, his voice gentle, patient, changed. Outside, the evening air was cool on her face, and she closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the breeze lift her hair. She breathed in and out. She turned her face to the fading light of the setting sun and smiled, small and tired but real, knowing that even in a world this broken, people could choose to change. The end. If you enjoyed this story of power, justice, and transformation, don't forget to give it a like and hit that subscribe button so you never miss the next one. I'd love to hear what you think. How did this plot work for you? Did the twist surprise you? Drop a comment below with your thoughts. And tell me, where are you watching from today? Let's keep the conversation going.